Hello and welcome back to a brand new DNF1 F1 podcast. I hope that you're all doing well as always, and thank you very much once again for joining us for a bit of F1 chat and discussion as we review the British Grand Prix, a personal favourite of mine, one of the most exciting races on the F1 calendar. Perhaps a little British bias thrown in there for good measure, but of course is always going to be an exciting one, even if not every single race is a true classic. But I digress. As always, we are joined on the review by our DNF1 panel. Tonight we have Courtney Pine and Lee Wannington, so we're all in full attendance this evening. And first of all, guys, let's start with the introductions and check in on the panel. Courtney, first of all, how are you doing, mate? Looking good as always. What did you make of the British Grand Prix?
For me, it was the best race of the 2023 season. The event itself looked fantastic. Obviously, you'll have a lot more to say about that personally. I think the event was great. I think the atmosphere was fantastic, and the emergence of McLaren has given me an awful lot of encouragement. I've been very vocal, and I know I've been the Debbie Downer about F1 2023 being boring. But the emergence of McLaren, for me, has given this season some well-needed life.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that being one of the true highlights of this weekend, the resurgence of McLaren and, of course, in particular, Lando Norris. But we will talk about that momentarily. Lee, let's check in with you. First of all, how are you doing, mate? And is there anything you wanted to add to Courtney's glowing reference of what we saw at the British Grand Prix this weekend?
I'm doing great, thank you, Adam. I'm quite chuffed. I mean, not every weekend we get a bold prediction right. And obviously, I predicted Lando on the podium. I got the position wrong on my podium, but Lando was on the podium, which before this weekend, you're like, well, that's crazy. That's such a... But McLaren turned up. Mika Häkkinen's prediction was correct. Obviously, he's in the know somewhere. The forever McLaren man. I don't know if he uses that, but he should. Yeah, it was a really enjoyable event. Obviously, as Courtney already alluded to, you should know more about that being in person. But from everything we saw over the live broadcast was very entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you're right. I did go to the British Grand Prix. I think I'm going to talk about my experience at the British Grand Prix in a bit more detail in a future podcast episode. I might throw in some tips and guides regarding what advice I would give to anyone that was considering going to not necessarily the British Grand Prix, but any Formula One race in general. So yeah, do keep an eye out for that one in the future, guys. That one will probably come out in the next few weeks or so. But anyway, of course, yes, Lee, you were right to point out Mika Häkkinen's bold prediction regarding McLaren back at the Canadian Grand Prix in June. He was saying that what was it? Just in terms of the speed of the car, they will probably challenge Red Bull. I think they will surprise us massively. A lot of people hearing that probably thought Mika had maybe had a few too many old drinks or any alcoholic beverage of his choosing after that one. But how wrong were we to doubt the great Mika Häkkinen? He obviously knows a thing or two about Formula One cars, a two-time world champion. So maybe we should listen to Mika a little bit more when he's enlightening us with his wisdom. But, of course, we should start momentarily with the first highlight of the race weekend, and that was once again Max Verstappen dominating as always. The margin that he had for victory wasn't necessarily the largest that he's had all season, although it did feel like the race was very much under control from him after he had re-overtaken Lando Norris to get the lead of the race back. It never really looked like he was under threat after that. And we get to a point now, guys, where Max has now won 6 races in a row. It's Red Bull's 11th Grand Prix in a row that they've won, dating back to the finale last season in Abu Dhabi. And I don't really think there's much more that we can say about Red Bull and Max Verstappen that we haven't already said. I mean, I feel like we could spend the first 10, 15, 20 minutes of this podcast, as we've done after almost every race review this season so far, and go on about how great Max is, how great Red Bull are, how dominant they are. They're amazing. They could win every single race. I'm sure we could do that again. But honestly, guys, I feel like our audience and those people watching and listening to us, wherever they get their podcasts from, probably would just be fine with us saying, you know what? Max is great. Red Bull are great. it's inevitable at the moment, and that's not us saying it's boring, but what more is there to say really right now than they're just great?
Yeah, I think the only thing I will say in regards to Max's weekend, and I'm going to surprise a lot of people, and I'm actually going to jump to his defence.
Oof.
Now, there's been a bit of noise about Max's radio messages, saying, "Oh, this doesn't feel right, that doesn't feel right." But we've known it, particularly the top tier drivers, whenever they're leading a race, they're listed and they're looking out for any of the feels, any weird sounds, anything that isn't quite right in that car that could affect performance and could potentially jeopardize a win. They're on the ball with it. And we saw, famously with Lewis Hamilton as well, when he was saying, "Hey, my tyres are gone." There was a bit of gamesmanship going on there. But these top drivers are always trying to find perfection. So when they feel something isn't quite right, they will try to highlight it. So yeah, there was the surprise. I've just defended Max Verstappen.
Wow. Clip it, guys, because it's not very often this season that Courtney does that. One of the more ardent Lewis Hamilton fans. But of course, I think it's a very fair point with Max Verstappen. I suppose there was one rather humorous moment in Q1 where Max had come out of the pits and broke his front wing, crashing into the wall in the pit lane. I'm sure Red Bull's accountants will probably be a little bit annoyed that now they have to pay out a little bit of money for an extra front wing. And in a cost cap here, obviously every penny is crucial, especially if you're Red Bull at the moment. But other than that, same old service right now. And I think, Lee, in a way, whilst perhaps it sounds like we're playing this down a little bit, just not to repeat ourselves, as we often do on this podcast when we talk about Max Verstappen and Red Bull's greatness at this point in time, I think in a way, whilst we're, some of us can enjoy this in different ways, we are probably going to look back on this era right now and say, you know what, they were really something special. For whether you love them or hate them, you have to acknowledge how brilliant this combination of Verstappen and Red Bull is at the moment.
Yeah, you do have to do the hats off to the team and driver. Personally, he's very much been like the Terminator at the moment. I'm going to explain my analogy of his ruthless efficiency that's also almost seems mechanical about how he goes lap after lap in qualifying, lap after lap he pulls out the time in race, lap after lap, the gap increases lap after lap. He gets exactly right what he needs to do, and the team delivers, and he also destroys his teammates at the same time. We saw Daniel leave the team, and obviously he went through his quick overturns with Pierre and Alex, and Sergio seems to now finally be crumbling under the pressure of Max. I mean, it's just a dummy. He's ruthless with efficiency and destroys his teammates. It's it works on both accounts.
Absolutely. And looking at the points tally right now, Max on 255 points. I mean, at this point in time, it's going to be a record tally, whatever it is at the end of the season, the way things are going right now. Currently, single-handedly leads the Constructors' Championship. If you take away Perez's points, he's 52 points ahead of Mercedes, so he's increased his lead over them by a point. I mean, we joke about this, and Perez obviously is contributing as well because Perez is currently P2 in the World Championship. We shouldn't forget that, despite his issues with his form. But what do you guys reckon? I'm going to put the question to you both now. Can Max Verstappen single-handedly win the Constructors' Championship? Because he's quite comfortable at the moment as it stands.
I think given how Sergio Perez is performing, not only that, but slowly but surely, some of the other teams are closing in the gap. So Sergio Perez continues to have difficult qualifying sessions, which he's unfortunately regularly doing now. He's going to find it harder to overtake the Astons, the Mercedes, the Ferraris, and even the McLarens. So I don't think Red Bull are going to get as many 1-2s as they probably would have hoped, given the level domination that they have. I still think they will go on and win the majority of the races for the rest of the season. But that fierce competition that we're now seeing developing behind them, they are chipping away at that gap. So, again, without repeating myself, he has to up his game or he will start dropping a lot of points.
But just to clarify, for the sake of the question, just for a bit of fun here, if Max Verstappen was a one-man team at the moment at Red Bull and we got rid of all of Sergio Perez's points, Max would be 52 points ahead of Mercedes in this Constructors' Championship. Could he win the Constructors' Championship all by himself?
Yeah, why not? I wouldn't even rule that out.
There we go. Lee, what do you reckon?
I would actually disagree. I don't think he would win it by himself. You just have to take it a hypothetical scenario, which we nearly saw at Silverstone with a 2-3 for McLaren. Winning and fastest lap, he would have scored 26 points, but McLaren would have scored over 30 points. So 53-point gap over we've got over 10 races of the season left. That's an outscoring of 6-7 points a race. That gap gets closed by the end of the season. So Max can't win it on his own if it's a consistent second, third for the next best team, same next best team. Also all hypothetical, I know, but
yeah. I was going to say, Lee,
disagree on that.
This is where I want to counter you here. Where it is so getting close behind, they're all going to be taking points off each other.
True.
I'm loving this battle, and look, you guys have had to rein me in at points because of my frustration at the front, because of how good it is behind P1. We have a fantastic battle going there, and it does. And my frustration, like it could be Max, like even if it was Charles Leclerc at the front doing the same thing. Sorry, I know you love to see that, but we've got such a good battle from P2. Do you see what I mean? Like it's brilliant, but imagine if we was having this on race wins.
Well, this is it, and I think this is the age-old discussion with Max Verstappen this season that, a lot of people, ourselves included, have at times moaned about how predictable this F1 World Championship is. And, rightfully so, the main draw and the main headline is who's going to be winning the races, who's going to be winning this World Championship. We've almost had to remove the star element of what makes Formula One great to a certain degree at the moment and what people are interested in order to find joy and excitement in this championship. Because if you did remove Max Verstappen and Red Bull out of the equation, this would be one of the all-time classic seasons with so much variety and so much craziness. Not many people, ourselves included, would have predicted that McLaren would be Red Bull's closest challengers this weekend. And as it were, that's exactly what we got. And there were loads of reasons for it. But if someone said to me, would McLaren be Red Bull's closest challengers in Hungary next time out? No, absolutely not. I would probably lean and say maybe Aston Martin will probably find their form, and on a track where slower corners, they will resurge up the front again. Ferrari, after dropping the ball this weekend, will most likely be back in the mix. I'm sure Mercedes will have something to say about that. For all we know, Alpine might get themselves back into the mix again. You just don't know. And I think that's what has made this F1 season very, very good, despite the fact that right now we are in an era where we've got one man and one team absolutely destroying the competition week in, week out. Funny enough, whilst you both were talking about that just briefly, I was sort of thinking in my head, would it be possible for McLaren, from their position, to win the Constructors' Championship against Max Verstappen? Never mind Red Bull in this, just for fun here. And I think, we've got 12 races left. And what if second and third, if they did that, that's a 6-point swing, so that's 31 points. Then we've got an extra point for fastest lap. And if we have the sprint races as well, so there's 4 sprint races left. So that would be, what's the swing on that? Like 7, 6, 13. Do you get a fastest lap point for the sprint race? I don't think you do, do you?
So.
I don't think so.
No, so that would be a 5-point swing here. I'm trying to do quick maths in my head, so I'm trying to work this out. So let's say there's a 20-point swing from all the sprint races for McLaren. There's a 7-point swing in every race remaining. 12 times 7 is 84. Then add 20. I don't think McLaren would catch Max Verstappen. I think the gap is 196 right now between Max. I think Max is 196 points ahead of McLaren. So yeah, unfortunately, McLaren would be about 90 points or so short, unfortunately. So yeah, if McLaren are going to win this Constructors' Championship against Max Verstappen, forgetting the Perez element to this, they might have to win a few races or hope Max drops out. At the moment, that doesn't look very likely, unfortunately. So yeah, unfortunately, the numbers don't lie on this one, I'm afraid. So moving on to more positive news with McLaren, we should talk about them because they were the highlight this weekend. And in particular, Lando Norris, the superstar at his home circuit. And I'm going to say this right now, I've been to so many sporting events in my time, mostly as a football fan, but at this particular race, when Lando Norris took the lead at turn 1 off the start, I had never heard a louder roar in my life, and it reverberated all across the circuit. You felt it. It gave you shivers, and it was an incredible moment, quite frankly. It's such a shame it only lasted a few laps, but it was absolutely brilliant. And I think that just sums up what Lando Norris has been for Formula One over the last few years and what he's starting to become. And hopefully this is the start of something special long term for McLaren. Hopefully this isn't just a small period where they're doing really well and Lando's showing how good he is, because right now this kid is something special.
Yeah, no, this is why both on the podcast and in private conversations that we have, I've been beating a drum. Lando needs to be driving for a race-winning team. He needs to be challenging for championships. And it's not only because of his raw talent beyond the wheel, but as you said, Adam, what he offers Formula One. I feel that Lando Norris has been one of the pioneers almost. Like, it's weird to put Lando Norris and pioneer in the same word, but let me elaborate. He has been one of that younger generation that's helped engage younger fans with the sport and, give it a new lease of life, because we know F1 can very easily go stale. It's sort of like it's a loaf of bread and you leave it out in a warm temperature. It can very easily go stale. And Lando Norris is just there to, as I say, just rejuvenate it. And I feel that if Lando goes on to, start winning races and start challenging for championships, again, I've said it personally, I think he will become a massive superstar, not only with like fans around the world, but in the UK in particular. We know the fans, do love Lewis Hamilton, but Lewis Hamilton, in terms of the general British public, he has divided opinion, whether we agree with it or not. But I do feel that if Lando went on to start challenging for races and championships, he would become a massive household name here in the UK.
Absolutely. And of course, solidified by the performance at the British Grand Prix. And we've been saying for a while with Lando Norris, as you've rightly pointed out, Corny, that this is a guy that is proving, when he does have the car underneath him and things are going well, to be more than just a guy that's got one lap pace in him. He has that racecraft element as well. Granted, we haven't seen too many occasions where Lando's been up against the best of the best in machinery that he can be competitive in and really fight them and come out on top. But I think we saw this weekend, with both Verstappen and Hamilton, that, Lando was able to get out on top against Verstappen in the early stages of the race until Verstappen was inevitable, and the car pace advantage that he had and the performance he put in as well to wrestle that back. But for me, it was towards the end of the Grand Prix when he was fighting against Lewis Hamilton. They were on the harder tyres. The virtual safety car kind of came out at a bad time, and then the full safety car came out, which threw all kinds of chaos, really. And I think McLaren, they had a line as to why they weren't able to put Lando on the soft tyres, which we'll get into momentarily. But he was on the hard tyres, fighting against Lewis Hamilton, who was on used softs as well. It wasn't like he had a brand new set of softs. And we saw the battle between the two. And the racecraft and the defensive ability where Lando was put in that car was superb. Chef's kiss. It was amazing defensive driving. And it was right on the limit as well. He was aggressive, but it was right on the limit. Lewis himself acknowledged how good that was from Lando Norris. He has acknowledged several times over that this kid could be something special. And I think we saw a brilliant example this weekend of how good Lando Norris is and how good he could be. Lee, I feel like I've said a lot on this already, and so has Corny. I mean, what are your thoughts regarding McLaren and Lando Norris this weekend?
Well, firstly, Courtney's been saying that Lando needs to be fighting at the front of the field, and we finally see that. So Courtney's wish is now fulfilled. Obviously, hopefully that's not just a one race off, and we have to obviously wait and see how McLaren's performance go over the rest of the season. But definitely, if McLaren can replicate this at other Grand Prix, even if it's just fighting in the mix of the podium, it's a great sight to see. I'd love to see McLaren up the top there, in the mix with obviously the McLaren, Ferrari, and Aston Martin. And obviously, Lando's now led more laps than Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz this season in just one weekend. So that's a nice leap up that statistic for McLaren. So really impressive stuff from Lando, and you can see why teams looking at Lando with not envy is the wrong word, but why they want him in their team. And I think Zach Brown and McLaren are going to have a hard job to keep hold of him when his contract expires, unless they can obviously deliver in the next year and a half this race-winning car, championship fighting. Even if they lose the championship, but just being in that position that Lando doesn't want to leave. And I think Lando's been quite crushed since 21 when he was last up there, and it's been a tough year and a half for him. So having this strong weekend and in Austria has really seemed to have lifted his spirits. So even a small victory like that can just be helping build his confidence for the rest of the season, even if he can't replicate the success they've had this weekend. It still lift him up in positives. I do also want to add, obviously, you said about Lando and the hard tyres. Piastri did a brilliant job defending against George in the same tyre combination. So there was hats off to both McLaren drivers in their defensive driving in those last few laps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what was key in that particular battle was the ability of the McLaren to be able to fire its tyres up very quickly. I think that's why McLaren were not panicking too much on the hard tyres. I think they sort of went of the opinion that if Lando was able to fend Lewis off for the first half a lap, he would have been able to fire those tyres up and manage to hold on to position. And that's exactly what happened. You know, there was a bit of a wobbly moment, I think a few laps afterwards, where Lewis tried to go up the inside of Lando at Copse and it didn't really work out. Lewis just didn't have the straight line speed to make that move work. And after that, Lando just drove off into the distance and had Hamilton beat all ends up. The same with Piastri. Was it Russell on the radio saying, like, the McLaren's on hards, like it was impressive? It just goes to show how far McLaren have come. And historically, McLaren have always gone well at Silverstone. Even when, you know, it sounds silly me saying that, being a fan of the 90s, McLaren go well at Silverstone, but even when McLaren over the last few years haven't been at their dizzying heights that they were of yesteryear, they were always pretty solid at Silverstone. The track suited a lot of their car characteristics, and it certainly did this weekend. And a lot of work has gone into the upgrades with McLaren this season. You know, we talked a lot about the development path changing very rapidly during the winter period, where they abandoned the car they were going to prepare to produce quite early on, and then they were going to face a period of difficulty and struggle as they were getting to grips with this new development. Then, of course, we had the upgrade package in Baku. We had the big upgrade package, the B-Spec car that Andrea Stella, the new team principal or technical director, was describing it. And then we had that in Austria, the 50% version of it. Then we had an extra upgrade this weekend at Silverstone. Apparently, we've got more coming soon, perhaps as early as Hungary. So McLaren have made huge steps forward. They've based a lot of their concept on the Red Bull concept. No surprise there. That seems to be the way for everybody at the moment. And now they're in a position where they could very much at this point have already leapfrogged Alpine. They look like they're very much in this mix now with Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin, nipping at the heels at Red Bull on occasion like they were this weekend. I don't think this is a one-off by any stretch. Although I will say, if any McLaren fans listening to this getting really excited, me saying, oh, they're in the fight now, I do think we're going to get a few weekends still, like Hungary, for example, coming up, where the slow speed nature of that circuit and the tight corners will make it hard for McLaren. I think there is a possibility that they could drop back into that battle with Alpine and perhaps behind the likes of Ferrari, Mercedes and Aston Martin. Maybe not, but I think it's likely for that. Lando Norris himself said that the car characteristics that they needed to solve over the last 5 years that have held McLaren back, they're about 30% solved, with 70% of fixes well on the way. So it's very encouraging news. But for McLaren, a lot of circuits that are coming up this season with high to medium speed corners, they are very much in the mix now. And we saw this in Austria. We saw this to some degree in Canada, although the race pace fell off. I don't think we're going to see a Barcelona situation where they look good over one lap and then they just completely drop off in the race because of tyre wear issues. So it's all looking up for McLaren right now.
Well, yeah, let's not forget that after Hungary, we have Spa. So you'd fill the Spa in theory, that should be another circuit that will suit McLaren. That will put them into a really positive mindset and them the team feeling buoyant going into the summer break. And then after that, traditionally, obviously, we have Zandvoort. That'd be interesting to see how they get on there. And then we have Monza as well, another high-speed circuit. So they will be able, in theory, they should be able to pick up, a good points haul in the next 2 or 3 races.
Yeah, and, that's important too. We also have to look at the long-term vision, what McLaren are going for here. We already emphasised a lot on the huge change of direction that Andrea Stella took the team on when he moved into this sort of the technical director's role, or team principal role, if you like, to replace James Key. And this new team of people that they're bringing in, they've already got Peter Prodromou, who's been helping Andrea Stella a lot, and he owed a lot of praise to Peter Prodromou for these upgrades that have come on this car. He, according to Andrea Stella, he's played a big part in this. There's that big reshuffle that's going on at McLaren with their technical structure. They're bringing in Rob Marshall from Red Bull in 2024, David Sanchez at Ferrari from 2024, two key figures of those teams that have been critical to their car development over the last few years and the success that's come with that. McLaren are very much moving in the right direction here. And I don't think it's going to be long before McLaren are right in the mix again on a regular basis with all those top teams. How far they can go remains to be seen. And I say this because we've been talking for a long time now about the possibilities that Lando Norris could have of fighting for race wins and world championships in other teams like Mercedes or Ferrari or Aston Martin or Red Bull even. But maybe, just maybe, McLaren may actually be the best place for Lando long term after all. We just can't see it yet.
Yeah, I still, my opinion that Lando is the best place for McLaren. I mean, I love McLaren, and I think Lando's personality fits in with this new structure of team that Zach Brown has developed, nurtured at McLaren. Is obviously a very different type of culture that was there in the past under Ron Dennis. It's more of the Red Bull kind of public atmosphere than the professional racing team that Ron Dennis developed over his tenure in charge of the McLaren. Not saying either or is a bad, but the atmosphere is just an example of the difference in the management style and the atmosphere. And I think Lando very much fits in that culture that Zach Brown has developed. And you can also say Lando is the poster child of this new era of McLaren. So I really hope it is the championship winning or championship fighting McLaren with Lando in it. That's my personal hope. I obviously have to wait and see if that ever occurs. But obviously, I don't want a driver of his caliber to be wasted and walk away with nothing in 20 years. And I could have won races, I could have won championships, or just joined another team.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that, Lee, and with a cheeky remark myself, I don't want to see Lando Norris become the Harry Kane of Formula One. Got the ability and just not able to get the big accolades because the team he's in is old and has been holding him back. So I'll just leave that one there. A little bit of Tottenham shade had to be done.
Well, Lando Norris has shown that he's capable of winning a trophy. So, yeah, maybe Harry Kane should go and join McLaren. Who knows? Maybe they'll get a trophy there. But anyway, football jokes aside, of course, because, we're Formula One fans here. Don't worry about that. I think it's worth noting, we in the past we haven't really, as I said, we haven't really talked glowingly about McLaren, but I think now that Lando has been able to see the effect of these upgrades, and he has been through a lot over the last few years of promise and disappointment, and more promise and ultimately more disappointment. Now that these developments are starting to bear fruit for him, and he is becoming more successful with the team that he's put a lot of faith in. Admittedly, they have put a lot of faith in him too, of course. It goes both ways here. But this could be the first sign of something special for McLaren going forward. And I certainly think Lando is central to that. He's an integral part of this plan for McLaren. And with the development going on, and with the infrastructure upgrades coming over the next couple of years, and the personnel changes, this could be something big for McLaren. And maybe, as we said already, Lando could well already be in the best place for his career right now at McLaren. But of course, we'll have to wait and see. Lee, let's move on to your sympathy pit lane, because I think you have an appropriate topic given we're talking about McLaren. So without any further spoilers, who's making your sympathy pit lane for the British Grand Prix?
Well, my driver for the British Grand Prix sympathy pit lane is Lando Norris's teammate, Oscar Piastri. Obviously, qualified brilliantly to get his place on the grid, raced brilliantly and was in P3 for most of the Grand Prix. And due to unfortunate circumstances of pitting just before the VSC and then the safety car, lost his position on the potential podium roster to Lewis Hamilton. And unfortunately, it was not in a position to get that back after the restart. And you think all the work that he did into that weekend, obviously still is his rookie season, and he's not had the opportunity to deliver these kind of results because the car hasn't been there to the start of the season. To then just miss out on the podium because of circumstance and not because of, he was overtaken or he made a mistake at McLaren's home Grand Prix. Obviously, would be a bit of a gut punch for him that he just missed his first podium, and has still got a bright future ahead. So I'm sure he will get another opportunity to fight for the podium. But it's still a shame that he lost his first potential podium, and that's why he has my sympathy this week.
Yeah, I think it was the only thing missing from this British Grand Prix. Other than what we saw go down this weekend, was the fact that Piastri wasn't able to get that podium that he thoroughly deserved this weekend. And of course, no disrespect to Sir Lewis Hamilton, but he very much capitalised on a situation where the car performance and what he was probably doing as well this weekend probably shouldn't have been in that position. And Piastri, of course, brilliant in qualifying, looked mega fast in the race. He was following Max and his teammate all the way through. And let's not forget as well, Oscar Piastri didn't have the upgraded front wing that Lando Norris had, which I think people were saying was about a tenth of a second deficit between the two, and between having the front wing and not having that front wing, the upgraded one. And it was only about a tenth of a second between Lando and Piastri on ultimate pace anyway throughout the race and in qualifying. So I think what it just goes to prove right now is McLaren. It's very easy for us to talk glowingly about Lando Norris with McLaren and acknowledge what McLaren have in Lando Norris. But you could easily put the argument forward that they also have another star driver in the making in Oscar Piastri. We just haven't seen as much of him as we've seen of Lando Norris for obvious reason. But for anyone who's followed Oscar Piastri in his junior career will know that this kid is special. Winning the Formula 3 championship in his debut season, like George Russell and Lando Norris, very successful there, and won the F2 World Championship like George Russell did. For example, Lando, of course, coming P2 that season against George. Nonetheless, they've got two special young drivers here. And as you've pointed out already, Courtney, Oscar, he didn't have the best start to the season. It was a bit difficult for him because of the issue with the car. And now that car is starting to improve, Oscar has gone with it. It's not like Lando has been brilliant and Oscar's been terrible. He's had the upgrades and now he's shown his performance as well. So, yeah, I do take my hat out. My heart goes out to the guy because, a podium would have been lovely for him at the British Grand Prix. But even still, it was a phenomenal performance from Oscar Piastri as well. So we certainly can't take anything away from him in that regard.
No, and it looks like he's made the right choice at this point when he had the choice between driving for Alpine and McLaren. And that battle's just going to become even more interesting because I think you said earlier on that McLaren have now leapfrogged Alpine in the constructors.
They have.
Is that right?
Yeah.
So, and let's be honest, we know that there is a lot of bad feeling from Alpine towards Alonso and Piastri. So for the Alpine team, if they get beaten by both of those drivers, that's going to stink. So I think Alpine are going to be a team to really keep an eye on because this championship battle, well, not championship battle, this constructors battle will be personal for some of the members of that team.
Yeah. And not to mention the fact that Alpine suffered a double DNF this weekend with Pierre Gasly, of course, unfortunate because there was damage that wasn't inflicted by him that cost him in that race. And of course, Esteban Ocon with reliability troubles. So a tough one for them to swallow. And as you mentioned, Courtney, this pretty much vindicates or even further that Piastri was right to snub Alpine and take on that seat at McLaren. It was a gamble at the time. And I think at the start of the season, a lot of us would have looked at that and thought, was it a mistake trying to find a silver lining or even a chrome lining? No pun intended there for this weekend. But one thing I will say, actually, just on a side note and not going off a tangent too much, we all slated the McLaren livery when we saw it for the British Grand Prix. I tell you what, when I saw it in the daylight on Friday in the hot sun, I was sitting at the Hamilton straight as well when I got to see them go by. It looked stunning. So I'm kind of glad it looked a lot better than it did in the renders because it certainly didn't do it justice, but it was a stunning looking car in life.
I do think if they'd got rid of the orange on the nose and made that silver, I think that would have improved it. But I agree, it did look better. And I personally think they should keep it. I just think it's synonymous with some of McLaren's more recent success. So maybe they can use that. Maybe Lando will be chirping on even more to be keeping the chrome livery because one race with it and they almost got a double podium. So who knows? This might not be the last we see of the chrome livery.
Yeah, absolutely. They might get lucky. I'm sure Jeff Bezos will be delighted to hear that the Google Chrome livery looked as good as it was fast. So, yeah, good
I do
stuff.
have a question for you both about McLaren as well before we move to the next bit. Adam, if you don't mind.
Go on then, go for it, mate.
So for both of you, the McLaren updates were unexpected in how much it gained in McLaren's performance. Does this mean that Ferrari and Mercedes, and to a degree Aston Martin, have to reevaluate their concept and their development plan for their teams going forward? That McLaren stopped their plan last winter, and within 6 months, they're now potentially the second fastest car on the grid.
Tough one. Well, I mean, Mercedes kind of have already, to a certain degree, although they've not fully committed to the Red Bull type concept. They're trying to go their own way with this. Ferrari, like Aston Martin already, have decided to converge down that route. But again, they're very limited by the cost cap regulations and the ATR regulations. And I think what we're seeing here is an indictment of those regulations. I think a lot of people were complaining about trying to change everything again because Red Bull were dominating, not acknowledging the fact that what we're actually seeing, it is taking a bit of time to work. But we've seen from Aston Martin this season already, McLaren the last couple of weeks, we are starting to see the smaller teams, relatively speaking, start to catch up. So I think the regulations are having a level of success here right now where we will eventually, hopefully, if they stick to what they're doing, end up with a Formula One World Championship where there's so much more variety and so much more even competition, where if we didn't have the cost cap, Mercedes and Ferrari in particular would have been able to spend so much more money to solve these issues much faster than they have been so far. And we'd all be complaining again that, oh, the bigger teams are just going to throw their wallets at this problem and it's fine. They can't actually do that now. So they are being pegged back. They're already talking about 2024. I think Mercedes after this weekend was saying we're pretty much gone for the 2024 car now because there's no point trying to catch up this season because we're just going to be further behind the next one. So that's where we are right now. It's allowed McLaren to catch up. It's allowed Aston Martin to catch up. And I'm pretty certain further down the grid, there'll be other teams looking at what McLaren are doing, what Aston Martin have done and think, you know what? If we get it right, that could be us as well. We could be fighting for podiums and race wins.
Oh, I was thinking that randomly earlier on that because I've been probably the most vocal, stating my issues, let's say, with the races all being decided by one guy, but behind him, we've all agreed that it is building up nicely, and and this was what most of the teams and the fans wanted from the 2022 regulation change. So long may that continue. But I think Lewis quoted to say that they might have started to have a real idea of what's wrong with the car. So I'm not saying it's going to be this season, but I think that Mercedes and I think Ferrari and maybe even like McLaren coming forward in the trajectory that they are. I don't want to jinx it, but maybe next year could be the year that we start seeing more teams in actual battles for race wins, because I just can't help but feel that this is the direction that we're going in. Maybe it's just me giving myself a dope of copium just to find a way to look forward. But these teams are, and look, we've seen it before, whether it be inter-team rivalries, drivers going against each other. When you're fiercely competing against each other, you bring the best out of each other. So hopefully these battles that are firing up will help propel them towards the front and challenge Red Bull more regularly.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. Let's move on to Mercedes, since we were talking about them earlier. Lewis Hamilton P3, George Russell P5. A weekend where I think we kind of felt Mercedes would be in the mix, but the ailments of their car would peg them back a little bit. As it were, the ailment, of course, was the straight line speed deficit and the drag that they obviously were suffering with. I think we saw this firsthand when Hamilton and Russell were battling away with the McLarens and the Ferraris to an extent as well. But ultimately, the safety car did help them out a little bit. They, capitalized on the situation, as Mercedes have been very, very good at over the last few years. When the opportunity arises, they do more often than not take full advantage of it when it comes their way. And I'd imagine they'd probably come away from this weekend feeling pretty happy about what they got, quite frankly. What do you guys reckon? P3 and P5, probably the best Mercedes probably could have hoped for?
Yeah, I think it was probably better than they were expecting based on how practice went. I think I can't remember the positions they said, but after the practice, I think they were expecting to be outside the points because their car was performing absolutely dreadful through P1 and P2. So to walk away with P3 and P5, I think they'll be quite happy that the weekend wasn't as bad as they may have been predicted by their computer models. So I think they will take that quite happily and move on to the next race. For us to be honest, it's a very good case of Mercedes damage limitation, I think.
And as I said, they've been very good at that. I think the only thing that probably surprised them was the fact that it was the papaya and chrome cars that were ahead of them and not the red ones, quite frankly. But of course, we'll get into that momentarily. Courtney, let's hear from you on this one. I think the biggest surprise this weekend, not necessarily the fact that Hamilton got onto the podium with Norris and Verstappen. I mean, Hamilton's Hamilton. He's always in there. You can never rule him out, and he's always able to capitalise on these moments. I think the biggest surprise this weekend was the lack of tyre degradation. George Russell was very bold to start on the soft tyres, and he ended up going very, very long in the race, pitting, unfortunately, just before the safety car had come out to put on those harder tyres and or the mediums, if you like. But yeah, I mean, what a strange way that played out. But it was an incredible job under the circumstances.
I think this just sums up where Mercedes are with their car. There are so many unknowns. We see that there's almost a lottery with their setup. You know, we discussed it many times on this podcast, particularly since they bought in this B-spec car, that they have a very peaky setup and it's very difficult for them to find it. And I just feel because of this, there are so many unknowns about this car. It could well turn out to be positive because if there's a lot of, should we say, learning space when it comes to this car, maybe despite them saying, oh yeah, we are going to move on to 2024, they might be able to find some pace in the current car they have. Look, they know they're pretty much stuck with it for the rest of the season. But if they're able to find the solutions with their setup issues, they might be able to have some more stronger races. So I feel that as frustrating as it was for Mercedes, I'm just trying to see it from a positive mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I said, you know, the tyre wear, the lack of tyre wear, I think surprised a lot of people because Silverstone is normally a very abrasive circuit. And I think, admittedly, it's normally a lot hotter than it actually was this weekend. I mean, it didn't catch too many people by surprise in terms of that it was actually going to be a little bit cooler because I think we all kind of predicted it would be. I think some of us probably forecasted rain throughout the race this weekend, which we never got. The clouds hovering over the circuit from what I could see where I was definitely teasing it. At one point, we had Red Bull saying on the radio to Max it was going to rain in a few minutes halfway through the race. And then we had the Mercedes radio to George Russell saying that the rain at Brackley was going to miss the circuit. And George Russell was checking to make sure that was the case. He couldn't believe it. He thought they were going to get some rain. So, yeah, it did surprise a lot of people. But Mercedes, again, did a brilliant job on putting themselves in a position to take advantage of that situation. George did a great job on those soft tyres to make them last. And they just kept going and going and going. I remember watching him follow or be in between the two Ferraris throughout the majority of that opening stint. And I'm thinking to myself, when are these soft tyres going to fade? He just kept staying with Leclerc on the mediums. And I thought to myself, something is weird about this because Leclerc should be getting away, but he wasn't. And Russell stuck with him. And then ultimately, Mercedes ended up beating Ferrari when Ferrari completely got the tyre situation wrong altogether. And that's a topic we'll get to in a minute. So, yeah, very strange one. But yeah, Mercedes once again making the best of a difficult situation on that one. I did want to move the conversation away from Mercedes if I can. Brief one on Ferrari before we move on to another topic. A weekend that probably promised a lot more for them. And I think many of us expected Ferrari to be Red Bull's closest challenger this weekend. Maybe even a double podium was probably on the cards for some people. And qualifying, despite McLaren's resurgence, I think a lot of us expected Ferrari to gobble McLaren up on the race strategy, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. And then again, as the race went on, Ferrari ended up doing Ferrari things and just completely clowning it on strategy.
Yeah, because their race pace wasn't actually terrible. Like we know that McLaren seemed to have the jump on everyone else. But it wasn't like they were struggling. Their race pace was solid. They were definitely in a race with Mercedes. But we've had this discussion on this podcast before. Spin the magic wheel and let's see how Ferrari can mess this up. And yet again, they did. They got the strategy wrong when it comes to the pits. But then again, it could well be car specific because McLaren seem to be doing absolutely fine on the hard tires. So I'm going to give Ferrari a little bit of a let off with that. But then at the same time, they have more knowledge of their car than other teams do. So maybe they need to be looking at themselves rather than reacting to the strengths of the other teams. Because McLaren are going hard, so will we. Maybe they need to look within their team more, and they might start getting some better results.
I think for me, and Lee, I kind of would be intrigued to get your thoughts on this as well, that, we joke about Ferrari bottling strategies and having that spinning wheel of how Ferrari are going to mess the race up this weekend. And for me, when it comes to Ferrari strategy, when they're aggressive, they get it wrong. When they're conservative, they get it wrong. And we saw both ends of that this weekend. They were aggressive on strategy, putting Leclerc onto the hard tyres to go one stop. And Pirelli at the time were teasing a two stop as the norm, like the soft medium soft, or the soft medium medium, or even the hard medium as a one stopper. And that was, a lot of people expected that to be the strategy. Ferrari took a gamble and wanted to go for a big undercut with Leclerc on the harder tyres to try and get ahead of the McLarens, to get after Max. And I remember Leclerc going in early, and I thought to myself, it's a bit of a surprise, but I was kind of expecting George Russell to follow him in, or at least some of the others. And that didn't happen. And then when Leclerc came out on the hards, his pace wasn't good. It took him a while before he eventually caught Stroll and overtook him. And he never really made good progress, to the point where Ferrari pitted Sainz, tried to do the same thing with him, didn't really work. Then when the safety car came out, they pitted Leclerc. For some reason, they didn't put him on the soft tyres. They put him on the mediums. Not sure why. They were being cautious on that. And they didn't even pit Sainz at all, when it would have made sense to put him on a fresh set of tyres. And he was getting passed left, right and centre. I think there was one phase when Perez had passed him, and then I think it was it Gasly, and then Leclerc after that. Crazy stuff. And Albon as well on the softs in the Williams. So Ferrari, once again, Lee, despite the fact that, as you mentioned, Courtney, that the car pace wasn't that bad this weekend. At the very least, they probably would have finished on the podium with Leclerc maybe, or maybe just behind Piastri. But I'm just running out of words to describe what is going on with them right now. Almost like they're having fun with this, or trying to come up with new ways to bottle situations they really shouldn't be doing.
Well, firstly, I think there's a bit of discontent within the team. Like you saw through qualifying, there was the whole mess about Carlos let Charles pass, and then Carlos took him back. And this is not the time to be messing around with grid order or lap position on a drying track. And obviously, I think you hear the rumours, and Carlos is very upset with the favouritism to Charles that's going on within the team at the moment, which probably have some grain of truth, considering who's come in to manage the team now. He's very pro Charles from obviously historic reasons, with Charles in the past. So I think there is a bit of discontent between the drivers. And then obviously Charles says yes all the time, where Carlos says no, I'm going to do it my way, and it sometimes works out for him. So they weren't in a great place going into the weekend, I think, as a team, because of whatever fallout happened on Saturday. May have rocked a few boats internally, and then on the Sunday, they just didn't react. And it's like, yeah, oh well, we'll just live with it. This is what we do now. And it's just no forward thinking or reaction. It's like, oh yeah, the hard tire didn't work for Charles. Oh, there's no point bringing Carlos in. Okay, let's just leave him out and let him suffer. That's his punishment for disobeying us yesterday. It could be. I mean, I'm just saying that in jest, but it's just a mess in the team at the moment. And unfortunately, I think it's going to get a lot worse before it potentially gets better.
Yeah, quite possibly. We haven't even factored that element into it yet right now, and not an easy thing for Ferrari. Despite having a couple of good weeks, the reality is they're far from free of their issues that they've been having. Both drivers were complaining about the car behaving quite differently in the windy conditions on Sunday. On Friday, they seemed to be a lot faster when it was quite warm and it was quite calm. And then, come Sunday, the pace, for whatever reason, just wasn't quite there. And Ferrari trying to go for broke, and it ends up blowing up horribly in their face, where they were quite fortunate actually to score points at the end of the day. So, yeah, plenty more for Ferrari to do going forward. Let's talk about Perez. And Sergio Perez, once again, difficult qualifying session for him. Didn't make it through into Q2. He was first out on the final run for the last few minutes, and Red Bull was saying that he lost a lot of tyre temperature and it was costing
another correct prediction.
Yep, another correct prediction. Yeah. Mustn't I forget on that one. But yeah, it's crazy stuff with that one. But it's the fifth race in a row now, or fifth. So not fifth. Yeah, fifth in a row where Perez has failed to make it into Q3. I think 3 of those he's failed to make it into Q2. He's got as many Q3 appearances this season as Alex Albon, and in the race, it wasn't exactly like he was coming through like a freight train either. The safety car actually paid him a huge favour to alleviate the delta, to even get some points, quite frankly. So, I mean, what can we say right now? If Perez was in any other team right now, and the demands were much more intense in terms of what they require from him, because, you know, without factoring in how great his teammate is at the moment, I'm not really sure how we could defend what's going on with Perez at the moment.
I think particularly given the characteristics of this Red Bull car, with their OP DRS, there's a lot of letters there. And that's my biggest frustration about this Red Bull, is that even if they're behind, their DRS is so efficient, they can easily get past people. But as you said, Adam, he's even starting to struggle with that, which, I'm sorry, which is saying a lot about his general racecraft on the rest of the circuit, because if he's losing that much of a gap to the guy in front of him, when they definitely have, obviously they have the best car on the grid, it's not a good look. But I think you've already kind of touched on it. I think he'll get away with it this season, but if it doesn't come out the blocks next season, and if other teams start catching up, he's going to find himself under a lot of pressure.
I mean, we talk about Perez's current future at the moment, and the weirdest part of all this stuff that's going on right now that I find a little bit hard to believe under the circumstances is Sergio Perez is still second in the Drivers' Championship. Seems crazy, right? Perhaps not to some, given the points he acquired earlier in the season, but you know, with everything going on at the moment, perhaps the variety that we're getting in the F1 season with different people challenging Max Verstappen has created a scenario where Perez is a little bit protected in that role. I suppose the question comes now that with Perez's descending form, if you like, and the struggles that he's having, and the issue that Red Bull seems to be having with him, is there really a suitable candidate out there right now that Red Bull could replace him with? Because whilst I'm having
Max Verstappen.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we can't clone Max Verstappen. I suppose for the rest of the F1 paddock, it's a good
That's
thing
their
we can't
secret
do
project.
Well, do you reckon Dr. Helmut Marko's just been plucking hairs from Max every now and then, or grabbing his hair comb and trying to create a clone of him?
Oh, I thought you were going to say something else then.
I don't even want to know where your head was going with that one, Colby. So
I was like, this is supposed to be a child-friendly podcast.
Yeah, and I think we should not discuss it any further to leave it that way. But
Yeah.
all jokes aside, when it comes to Sergio Perez, I can't think of an outstanding candidate that could replace him right now at Red Bull that would tick all the boxes they would want, and you know, and going with the nature of how Red Bull go about these things. But I can't defend what's going on either. It's almost to the point now where I wouldn't be surprised if they stuck with him next year, or if they replaced him next year for next season at this point. I'm kind of torn 50-50 on this one.
Personally, I just think they should get Nico Hulkenberg in there so he can get a podium. And it's just like,
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
we're giving you a podium, just come second.
I mean, if you can't do it in that car, it's just not going to happen. But he was another unlucky one this weekend, old Hulkenberg, for different reasons. Funny enough, he tangled up with Perez, didn't he? Coming out of, what was it, turn 3, chipped off his front wing, and that kind of ruined his chances this weekend. And on a circuit where tyre deg was actually quite low, he might have actually fancied his chances at a point in the Haas this weekend. But yeah, it's, I mean, we've got, there's the obvious names. Tsunoda, I don't think he's quite ready for that yet, although I do think Red Bull may look to that in the future. Obviously not De Vries. I mean, there's rumours going around he may not even be in the AlphaTauri car after the summer break, given that Ricciardo has a tyre test, I think, on Wednesday that we're recording this. I think Dr. Helmut Marko was referencing that, saying we'll see what happens. And I think a lot of us probably look at this Ricciardo tyre test as not necessarily being a tyre test, it being an opportunity for Red Bull to really corroborate what they've been seeing on the sim with Ricciardo versus what's actually happening on the track. And if the data matches up with what they feel is going on in the sim, and they've been quite glowing in their references to his performance in the sim at the moment, that could be what they need to make that decision going forward. Could Ricciardo be in the mix for that Red Bull seat again? Could Albon be in the mix for that Red Bull seat again? It's unlikely for Red Bull to go back, to a driver they had before, but I do think it would be a bit ironic for Albon to be the guy to replace Perez, given Perez was brought in to replace Albon. I mean, what do you reckon, Courtney?
I personally believe it wouldn't be the best idea for Albon to go back to Red Bull. We know that he's come back a much better driver, but I still remember, what both Gasly's and Albon's experiences at Red Bull did to them mentally. So I wouldn't want them to potentially go back into that environment again. I do feel that we've all said it, Max is almost robotic, and I think it's so demoralizing for certain drivers to be his teammate. I just think you're coming up against a driver like Max Verstappen. We've seen it in the past with Lewis Hamilton, Michael Schumacher. You have to be a special driver yourself, and that's why I have been saying it for a long time now. I can imagine Lando Norris going to Red Bull, but obviously what's happening with McLaren, and maybe Lando wouldn't want to go into a team like that. He'll probably be the number 2 driver. So you're right, Adam. I'm fully with you. It wouldn't surprise me if they stuck with Sergio Perez.
I mean, at this point, you couldn't rule anything out with Red Bull. I mean, this is Red Bull. They're quite cutthroat and ruthless about this. It's been a part of their success story as well as to why they've done that. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but, sometimes you have to be ruthless. Let us know in the comment section, guys. Do you think Perez will still be in the Red Bull in 2024? And if not, who do you think will replace him? Plenty of options, but for the life of me, I'm kind of torn. I couldn't really give you a name right now that I'm 100% confident would do it. But I also couldn't be 100% confident that Red Bull are satisfied that Perez is the guy to be in that car. I mean, we've said this loads of times before, that Red Bull, what they want in a number 2 driver, at the bare minimum, is what Mercedes wanted in a number 2 driver in Valtteri Bottas when he was with Lewis Hamilton. And that is that when Max is dominating in this case, if there is any chance that something goes wrong for Max, whether it be reliability or he ends up starting at the back of the grid, at the very least, Perez is there to pick up the pieces and get the result. And to his credit, in races that Max hasn't won this season, Perez has won. So we shouldn't ignore that, because I'm sure someone will point that out to us in the comment section. You're saying that as if Perez hasn't won the races Max hasn't won. He has. But at the end of the day, if something happened to Max at Hungary, do I think Perez would win that race? No. I think someone else would. Will it be Hamilton? Will it be... I hope not, because my bold prediction will be up in tatters if he does. So, you've got to worry about that. But, that is where Red Bull, I think, what they're probably thinking right now. That is their main concern. With someone as good and machine-like as Max at the moment, perhaps it's not something they should worry about too much. But I think that's why they've been on the radio to him saying, look, don't go for this fastest lap. Don't go for that. Just bring the car home. We want the W. Don't risk it.
Yeah, it's very easy for Red Bull to say that, but Max, being the machine he is, just wants every point he can get to the detriment of the team or his teammate. That's what makes Max who he is and the champion he is, obviously getting every point. But yeah, with Sergio, it's an unknown for sure.
Very much so. Courtney, I know we talked about this before we started doing the episode. You didn't really have much of a rant section to talk about, but was there any controversy or anything you wanted to bring up that perhaps might be worth mentioning from this weekend's race?
Yeah, it was the old Martin Brundle's grid walk, which has caused quite the stir.
I'm guessing this was the incident with the model/actress Cara Delevingne. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is the. You probably pronounce it a lot better than I would, so well done for that.
I don't even know if I pronounced it right. I mean, Cara, if you are by any chance listening to this, wherever you are, I do apologise if I've got it wrong. But yeah, this was a very, very interesting one, because Martin Brundle's Grid Walk has been very synonymous with the F1 broadcast before the race. A lot of people still tune into it. Admittedly, I mean, I was there, so I didn't really see it, but at the time, but I don't really follow the pre-race broadcast stuff. I quite often just make myself a cup of tea, sort myself out, usually to make a bit of Sunday lunch, and then I'll sit down about 5 minutes before the race, have a look through social media or the F1 related apps or whatever to make sure I'm up to speed with if there are any issues for any drivers or anything that's happening last minute I need to be aware of, and then just watch the race. But I know some people do invest a lot in time in this. And I think throughout the grid walk, there were other celebrities that were being interviewed. I think Damien Lewis might have got an interview at some point because he was singing the national anthem, and I mean that was interesting in its own right. But Sam Ryder obviously sang the national anthem last season. He was there this weekend. Florence Pugh, the actress, she was there this weekend. She waved the checkered flag. I think she was there as an invited guest of Sir Jackie Stewart, because of the program that she's involved in, Racing for Dementia, I believe it is. So, a wonderful cause there she was a part of, so it was great to have her there. Brad Pitt was obviously shooting shooting scenes for the new film with the Apex F1 team, the fictional team, and that was interesting seeing those cars going around. Not to go off too much of a tangent, but I might have to put on my CV that I was an extra in a Brad Pitt film, because I was there watching the cars go around. There might be a scene where, unlikely me being in the grandstand, but I'm definitely claiming it. It's like all those young actors or the kids walking through Diagon Alley when they're filming the Harry Potter films you never see of again. It's literally the same thing. So I'm claiming that on a side note. But no, back to the issue at hand before I go off tangent again. Martin was interviewing a few people. Then he gets to the point where he interviews Cara, and he basically says, "Oh, hi, Martin Brundle here for Sky F1 TV or Sky Sports F1. Just asked a few questions," and she basically said no, she didn't want to. It looked like a fairly polite no. I don't think she was being difficult or rude or anything. She was looking towards the Alfa Romeo F1 rep who was with her this weekend, because she was a guest of the Alfa Romeo F1 team, and she basically said, "Oh, I've been told I don't have to talk," and Martin said, "Oh, well, that's kind of the deal here. You're on the grid. You have to talk to us." I think he was alluding to, was it F1 or Liberty Media or the FIA, whoever it was that put in this new rule, apparently, that the celebrities or invited guests that come onto the grid have to talk to journalists or people that ask them questions. Again, I don't know if that's 100% true, but there was that obvious confusion there. And then I think Martin made that comment afterwards when she basically rebuffed him. After she gave a thumbs up to the camera, rebuffed Martin, and Martin said, "Oh, well, I'm sure it would have been interesting anyway," and walked off. This has brought up a lot of controversy, a lot of reaction on social media, a lot of people arguing from Cara's side, a lot of people, including Sky F1's Karen Chadlock, arguing the Martin Brundle side, saying that, look, the celebrities are here as invited guests, they get free grid passes, they're treated like royalty. If a journalist wants to ask them a question, they're obliged to do so. Or perhaps we should give these grid passes to people that perhaps a little bit more worthy, like perhaps local school children and stuff like that. So a lot of back and forth there. Hopefully I've kind of summed up the scenario for those of you that haven't seen it. But if you haven't, I recommend going onto YouTube. I think Sky F1 put something up there. I think about 4 minutes in if you wanted to skip it. So what's your guys' take on this? Because I'm quite interested to hear from you both on this one, because it seemed a very messy situation. But I don't really know if you can lay blame on one side or the other for this.
Yeah, if I was to put any responsibility anywhere, it would be the middlemen in this, the representatives or bodyguards, whoever's, miscommunicated to her that, she doesn't have to speak to anybody on the grid. But at the same time, I know there are a lot of people that believe if you're really that passionate about motorsport, you'd be willing to, have that conversation live on air like the way we did with all the other guests. But then we don't know what communication was said to the other guests on the grid. So I think it's very easy to jump to conclusions without getting, the full information of exactly what happened with the middlemen. But at the same time, I've seen some of the reaction towards online towards Martin Brundle personally. And we've had some claiming that he has a problem with getting rejected by women. And for me, I'm not going to get too deep on this exactly. And I just feel that in this day and age, I just feel there's a meal made out of every small thing. And I guess this is probably one of the reasons why I'm making this my rant of the week, is that can we stop with attacking people's character over little moments. They've had a disagreement. There's clearly been a miscommunication. I think there were wrongs on both sides. I think I can level it out. I don't think anyone was more wrong than each other in that. Was the comment a little bit snidey and a little bit inappropriate, perhaps? But I think we need to stop making we need to stop judging people's personalities and actually everything else that they've done throughout the years over little minuscule moments, because it ruins careers. And I don't want to see, I doubt it will. I don't want to see this little moment escalate and we see, I don't know, Martin Brundle potentially getting cancelled over it, because he's been a he's been a fantastic broadcaster and he's been fantastic for Formula One as a sport in general.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Lee, what are your thoughts on this?
First thing that comes to mind is track limits. And I'm going to say, the comparison is that
brilliant.
Although it doesn't happen the frequency or track limits that we had in Austria, it's somewhere that we need to avoid going forward. It's awkward for all parties involved.
Yeah.
And there needs to be some clarification. Obviously, we came out of Austria and the FA made the recommendation about the goal trap. But for the comparison, there needs to be some clarification from Formula One regarding celebrity guests on the grid. If they are expected to talk, they should know that before entering on the grid. Or if they are allowed to refuse it, then obviously the broadcasters should know who they cannot approach, or who maybe they don't approach any of the celebrity guests and just speak to the drivers and the team personnel. But there needs to be some clarification either way, because it's not fun for either party to have the awkwardness on live TV or going through this for both parties. And it's something that for this global sport, they should be avoiding. There needs to be some clarification from Formula One, and that's what I say on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a very, very good point, and something I wanted to draw on, because we all remember the incident with the artist Megan Thee Stallion, and that was a bit of an awkward one with Martin Brundle. Obviously, the bodyguard being a bit rough with Martin, and Martin saying, look, I can do what I want, or I just did that. Like, those comments that social media go, oh, pipe bomb, or, I don't know if that's the right way of putting it, or probably appropriate. I don't know. I apologise. But, mic drop. That's the one. That's what I'm looking for. I was thinking of CM Punk, the wrestler thing. Anyway, that aside. Yeah, you get those situations or those stuff being taken out of context. I've seen a lot of people go back and forward, whether they're in Martin's camp on this or if they're in Kara's camp on this. And I think almost all of those arguments arguing the one side are kind of missing the bigger problem here. It's fine if you belong in one camp, but I feel like the issue is not, is it Martin's fault or is it Kara's fault? Is she being a sports celebrity? Is Martin being an old misogynistic dinosaur that can't stand women saying no to him? I don't think it's either of those things. Exactly. But the problem is that's what's being given the airtime. The issue at hand here is what you mentioned, Lee. F1, the FIA, Liberty Media, they need to really get a grip with this, because from what I saw, the argument for Martin here is that when he was saying to Kara, like, that's the deal, you have to speak to us if you're on the grid here as an invited guest. And Martin, from what I understand, was referring to the fact that they had made this a ruling following the Megan Thee Stallion incident, that you can't just reject a journalist. You're a guest, you're invited. As a celebrity, you do add value to this, because obviously as a broadcaster, you want celebrities showing up to these events because you want their fans or these events to appear more glamorous. That's kind of the point. That's why they're here. They don't just invite them out of the goodness of their hearts. If they did that, they'd be having school children in the local area, or men and women and everybody else in the NHS and stuff like that coming to these events. Those are the people you would see. But quite frankly, Dr. So-and-so is not going to be as interesting to talk to on an F1 grid as someone like Cara Delevingne, for obvious reasons, And it's not personal, it's just that's what the media industry are interested in. That's where the stories are. So, not to get too sidetracked here, but F1 have to do something about this. They have to make sure they confirm or deny whether or not a celebrity or an invited guest has to talk to the media when they're approached on an F1 grid. Just be firm with it and be consistent with it, because from the impression I got was Martin was of the opinion that was the case. Cara at some point throughout this weekend, or was repeatedly told by the F1 representative that she was with, that she didn't have to if she didn't want to. So I don't think she was being spoiled or being rude or by any stretch being horrible to Martin, saying, no, I don't want to talk to you. I think she was probably felt she was within her rights to do that because that's what she was told. So there's a miscommunication on the F1 rep's part, who was looking at Martin saying, no, don't talk to her. And it's like, well, it's either one rule or the other. You've got to follow the rule, whatever it is. So I think everybody that's trying to put an argument here to saying Kara's being rude or she shouldn't be involved in motorsport, she doesn't care. Well, obviously that she has an interest in motorsport. She was at the Formula E. She's driven one of their cars. She clearly likes her cars. So yeah, why not? She's clearly a fan. You don't all have to be smiling and joyful like Sam Ryder was, or Florence Pugh, or even Pep Guardiola, who was there this weekend, probably giving Toto Wolff tips on how to win another title. I mean, that's a meeting of the minds, them two. But yeah, I as I said, I think F1, the FIA, Liberty Media need to draw a line in this and actually just clarify everything, because at the same time, I don't think Martin would have made a snide comment to her or said this is the deal if he was told beforehand that you're not allowed to ask this person a question, or they don't have to. I think he would just put the microphone there, and if she wasn't interested, he'd have just carried on. That's how it is. I think people are just drawing way too many out of context conclusions of this. It's not necessary. Let's just get some clarification on this and just move on, quite frankly, because it's getting stupid now.
Yeah, I think, Lee, your analogy with the track limits was perfect, because the way that we've reviewed it, I think is the best way to review it. It was exactly like the track limits thing. The obscurity, the grey areas have once again whipped up a lot of controversy. So at least it was about the off-track. At least it was about off-track matters and not on-track matters this time. So well done to the FIA. They've improved in that sense.
Well, they didn't even follow their own track limits, did they, this weekend? Because didn't Stroll not get a penalty for... I know he got a penalty for track limits, but didn't he not get a penalty for hitting Gasly and taking him out of the race?
Yeah, that's right. Well,
so
Gasly put it out on signs, didn't he? So
yeah,
the safety car went over the track limits as well.
Yeah, I know. Where's the 5-second penalty for the safety car? Despicable. They should call it Adam's rant this weekend at this point, but anyway, but I'm beaming either way, so it's all good. But guys, of course, let us know your comments on this one. Please feel free to weigh in on the latest Martin's Grid Walk controversy, because clearly that's what everybody's talking about at the moment, rather than celebrating what was an incredible weekend for McLaren and Lando Norris and all fans at the British Grand Prix. I don't agree, Courtney. I don't think it was the most exciting race in terms of like the best race of the season, but there was plenty of excitement for different reasons. For that regard, but still, guys, make your mind up as you always do, and let us know what your thoughts are. But of course, don't forget to check us out on YouTube if you're listening to this on your favorite audio platform. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and of course, if you are listening to us on your favorite audio podcasting platform, don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. Really helps us out a lot. But until next time, guys, we will be back with another episode for you very, very soon. But until then, stay safe as always, take care, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, as always, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1. Take care.
See you soon.
Bye-bye.